I thought I would just begin by talking a little bit about what led me to write the article that was the immediate cause of gathering together these panelists to have a discussion about child welfare and child protective services. I had read, I mean, probably most of you who are not involved in the system know about child protective services chiefly through reading accounts in the newspapers, often tabloids, about awful failures of the system when a child is killed. And that's really what I had read. And at that time, as you know, everyone involved is excoriated, the caseworkers, the head of the Child Protective Services in that place, the mayor, everyone is held to be, have failed dreadfully. And of course, in some way they have. But whenever I would read those accounts, I would think, well, this is a very, very difficult and incredibly consequential decision to take a child away from his or her parents. And it's understandable, or it seemed so to me, that sometimes in the effort to keep a family together, people would get this decision wrong. And so having read so many accounts of the system failing and this decision being made badly, I wanted to see how it was made ordinarily and sometimes hopefully well. And so I went to sit in on the Bronx Family Court. And I wanted to remember to just set the stage. Lest anyone think this is a marginal problem affecting only very few families, I should say that nearly 40% of children in this country will be involved in some kind of investigation by child welfare services before they're 18. And for African American children, it's over 50%. So this is not a small thing. This is a very widespread problem that affects almost half our children. So when I went to sit in the Bronx Dependency Court, I sat there on and off for several months. And one of the first things that was striking to me was that there was very little of the violent abuse that you read about in the newspapers. Most of the cases were what's classified as neglect. And that could be all kinds of different things, but many of them looked a lot like poverty. So for instance, if a parent needs to go to work and can't afford childcare, what does she do with her children? A lot of the time she ends up leaving them home alone and hoping for the best. And sometimes that will work, but if one of those children gets injured because they're children by themselves, then that mother may end up in court and may even lose those children. That kind of thing where it gets classified as neglect, which is of course a term that suggests the parent has been a bad parent, but in fact is inextricable from the material circumstances in which she finds herself. And another thing that was noticeable in court to me as a neophyte was how much of the time was spent discussing not whether or not someone was a good parent, but whether she, and it's often she, so excuse the pronoun, whether she was complying with the requirements of the system that she had been put upon her in order to get her children back. Things like attending parenting classes, attending, if relevant, domestic violence therapy, late and being, or if she was late to appointments at the foster care agency, let's say, or late to an appointment with the caseworker, these things would be held against her and would be a reason not to give her children back or a reason to add to the ledger of faults that was going to eventually result in her children being taken away. But when I would listen to the services and how they were described and the schedules that were described, some of these services are so time-consuming and so inflexible that a parent, in order to fully comply with them, has to quit her job. And then, of course, she does not have the income that will be held further against her as a fit parent for her children. So you can understand how there were all kinds of tangles in the system that that I saw going in. And I ended up focusing on the case of a young woman named Mercedes, not because it was an especially egregious case. It's an awful, heartbreaking story, but it is very ordinary. It was, when she first got involved in the system, it was 2009. Her case is not yet finished. At the time, she's now, I think, 29 or 30. So it's basically her whole adult life that she's been involved in the system. Can you hear me now? Yes. Okay, I'm sorry if you couldn't hear before. And what happened, the sort of founding incident was she had two little kids. One was 9 months old, one was 2, and she was running a bath. And she had intended to curl her hair while her kids were in the bath. She plugged in a curler, left it on the sink, went to go get, the kids were playing in the living room, she went to go get towels for them after the bath. She hears crying in the bathroom. She goes in, her daughter, the 9-month-old, has pulled the curling iron down by its dangling cord and burned herself on her legs. Mercedes looked at the burns. They did not, at that point, look serious, so she thought, okay, these burns I can treat at home. The next day, however, the burns looked worse, and she told her aunt, I'm going to take my child to the emergency room to treat the burns. The aunt said, do not do that. If you take this child to the ER and they see these burns, they will take her away. And so she didn't go to the ER. This turned out to be the wrong decision, but I do emphasize that the aunt was not being paranoid. That could well have happened. So somehow this came to the attention of Child Protective Services, and Child Protective Services made the argument in court that she had burned the child on purpose. The judge did not believe them and did not agree to remove the children at that point, but she asked Mercedes to submit to parenting classes, a variety of services. Mercedes went through these services. The judge mandated that she live with her mother to give her some help with parenting, but did not take the kids away. But at a certain point, however, ACS continued. ACS's Administration for Children's Services. That's what child protection is called in New York City. It's not called that elsewhere, but it's such a long, complicated case. I'm trying to boil it down. ACS continued to argue for the removal of the kids on various grounds. Mercedes' apartment was not tidy enough, they said. She had failed to appear at an appointment with them. She sometimes smoked marijuana. All these things the judge said no. But finally she fought with her mother. They got along very well when they were not living together, but when they lived together, they would tend to fight. I know no one can relate to this. And she had moved to a shelter with her 2 children. And at that point, ACS told, and her 2 children, sorry, this is so confusing. Her 2 children were sick, very sick. Her 2 younger children were very sick with congenital illnesses and were hospitalized. And at that point, the combination of the shelter and the children being very sick, ACS, the Child Protection, told her, either you give them up if you give them up temporarily to either your mother or your mother's friend, we will arrange for you to get permanent housing, and you'll get them back when they're out of the hospital. And so she said yes. This turned out to be a mistake. This was 7 years ago. And the case became so Byzantine that at no point did it involve the kind of abuse that you might expect would result in the removal of children from their parents. Though at one point the children accused Mercedes of abuse, but they were also accusing many people of abuse, and the social workers involved thought that the foster parents were coaching the children to say this, because another complication, I'm sorry to load them on, is that the foster parents were getting a great deal of money to keep these kids and also were attached to them, and so they had a strong motivation to make things so that Mercedes would not get them back. So at this point, even though it seemed that no one ever believed that Mercedes was guilty of abuse because, number one, she was never arrested, she was never prosecuted, no one ever actually did anything legal about it. Moreover, she had a 4th child who was never taken away. So presumably if they thought she was guilty of abuse, they would have removed the 4th child, but no one ever did that. Nonetheless, almost as a result of the momentum of the case itself, as soon as one accusation was made and resolved to be unfounded, another one would be made. The years went by. The children had spent almost all of their childhood at this point with the foster parents. And now, although the case is not finally resolved, it looks extremely unlikely that she will ever get them back. And the apologies again for this very complicated story, but this is not unusual. But the point is, although I believe that there are points in this saga at which the judge, caseworkers made the wrong call in this or that incident, overall, this system, the complicated thing about this system is that it is not a matter of dreadful, uncaring people punishing parents because they are hostile. On the whole, it is a system comprised of people who are well-meaning and hardworking and believe they are working for the benefit of children and families, but they have been given enormous power to determine the lives of people that they don't know very well, with the threat of dreadful consequences if they get it wrong. And this situation is one that produces time and time again disasters like the one I've just described. So I present that story to you so you get something of a background of what we're talking about. And now these are the real experts that are going to explain both how we got here and what might alleviate the current situation. Michael, I want to start with you because you have been involved with this juvenile justice system since there was such a thing in child protection, and you have helped to form the law, helped to write the law literally from the beginning. And so I wondered if you could take us through how the child protective system and its laws came to be the way they are now, including the Adoption Assistance and Child Welfare Act of 1980, which you drafted. What problems were you responding to in drafting that act, and what did you hope it would achieve?
So what I'd like to do is, this is a really terrific article that I hope you all will get a chance to read, because it captures with a story, but also with an introduction, all of the terrible difficulties of designing a system to protect children but to support families in it. This is the epitome of the cases that are there, and the article raises all of the central issues. I've been working on this issue for 50 years. 51, actually. There's one other person in this room, Judge Len Edwards, who has been working on, who's the world's greatest juvenile court judge, who has been working on it with me for 51 years, and still trying to figure out what it's about and how to make it a system work after 50 years. So I want to put this into a little context, because I think this is really a central thing that we ought to be paying attention to in the world. Yeah. And so think about if, as a society, if we had 4 basic goals for children, that we only had 4 basic goals for children in growing up. We wanted all of them to be safe, physically and mentally, that they're not that their basic safety isn't harmed. They don't have broken bones, that they're not sexually harmed by somebody, that they develop reasonable physical and mental health, that as they grow up, that they have reasonable physical and mental health, that they develop the academic educational capacities to earn a reasonable livelihood as adults, and that they also develop a social emotional development that makes them feel adequately good about themselves and have a capacity to relate to at least one other person in an ongoing, meaningful way. Let's just say those were our 4 goals for children. Essentially, in the United States, the critical aspect on all of these things falls on parents. It's parents who influence it, all of these outcomes, and they have the primary responsibility. There are basically only two ongoing institutions that people are required to be part of on these things. One is the educational system, where kids have to go to school, which largely focuses on the outcome of do they have the skills to earn a living. And there, as many people in this room know, it's been very hard to design an educational system that does that for all children, and poverty is intimately related with that issue as well. The other system, the only other system with responsibility, is Child Protective Services. It is a residual system that is designed to protect for safety. That's its goal, is to make sure there is basic safety. Unfortunately, it is not a system that works very well. Larissa mentioned, and I just want to put it in context because a lot of you may think about, the numbers that 15% of kids don't graduate from high school, or other problems in the 10, 15, 20% range, or 20% of kids live in poverty. Recent studies have indicated that 40% of the children that were born in the 1990s had a Child Protective Services report before they reached age 18. Every year, there are reports on 7 million children. 10% of all of the children in the country are subject to a report. There are over 3 million investigations, 3 million children investigated. So 5% of all of the children in any given year, and many different children each year, that's how it adds up, 5% will have a protective service worker come into their house and investigate what's going on. They are overwhelmingly poor, and we're talking about this then happening to 50, 60, or 70% of poor people, and it's heavily concentrated in a lot of high areas of poverty. So this is a system that affects a large number of families and outcomes. It's also a system that has to make incredibly difficult decisions in which the information is very hard to get. Larissa talked about Mercedes, who is very typical, talked about neglect, but determining whether or not whether the burns to her children were accidental or intentional is a very hard issue. Nobody observed it. You have to draw inferences from where the burns were. The children were too young to say anything. And of course, we don't want to leave children in a situation where they're going to be burned again or killed. On the other hand, we don't want to be intervening where it's unnecessary. Of the 7 million reports, ultimately, about 700,000 each year are substantiated cases. The court becomes involved, and about 200,000 of those children get removed. So the cases that get to court are a funnel of the more serious cases, and the removal cases are even a smaller funnel, but a very serious situation, because removal is traumatic for kids, for parents. I was involved when we first began creating a juvenile court on this after the battered child syndrome was discovered with children suffering multiple injuries, with a goal, and the goal of the system that we drafted legislation was to focus only on the most serious cases where there was safety involved, to get quick decision-making, because children have a limited time frame. They can't be kept in systems forever. So we drafted a set of things that created presumptions for keeping children at home, support for families if they got there, but particularly for very young children, time limits in which if they weren't able to be reunited with their parents, they would be adopted or given another permanent family. And that time limit was set at 2 years. That system, just as is described, has not worked. And just one point, and that I'll point out, is it was 2009 that Mercedes came into this system. It's 2018 now. Under the laws that were drafted, this case should have been over with 7 or 8 years ago. There was a time limit. You can go everywhere despite the law. This is, I'm trying to tell for the law students here, drafting a statute is easy. Getting it implemented is really, really hard. And in order to get it implemented well, requires really competent judges and advocates and people on the ground working to make the system operate as the legislation lays it out, which didn't happen in Mercedes' case. And one of the great fortunes that we have tonight on this panel is to have two people who are now playing a role on helping carry out systems, and will describe for you what it really requires on the ground to make a system that was framed to be just about safety and with time limits and with permanence actually operate, as opposed to the story that Larissa has told in the New Yorker.
So, yes, I mean, Victoria is now working, as you heard, as a mentor to parents who are currently involved in the system, but she I want to ask her first to tell her own experience of the system and the ways that it worked and didn't work for you, because happily your story is somewhat less desperately sad than Mercedes' story. It has a better ending.
Yes, you're right. The system coming into my life actually saved my life, and that's just my story. The experience, of course, was heartbreaking. You know, I was separated from my son for the first time. He was 4, and I didn't have a job. I didn't have a place to call my own, and I had a drug problem. And it was just him and I was suffering mentally, and I had no idea what was going on, and I had what I learned is called now a drug-induced psychosis, and so I think the only thing that I can share about the beginning stage of my experience that I hope could have gone differently was my first initial interview with the investigating social worker. That happened while I was on a hold at the emergency psychiatric hospital. And I remember being asked a bunch of questions that I didn't think were fair, and I began to reply belligerently and in ways that I am very regretful replying, because I ended up reading all of this after in my report. And I just couldn't believe what I was reading, and a lot of those things I was like, I didn't say that. And then some things were kind of awful, and I was like, dang, I really said that, and I probably shouldn't have. And I just feel that nothing that I said that day should have been taken seriously. I was not mentally stable. But of course, when I left that hospital, I left not knowing any information about what happened. I left with no medication, no diagnosis, and a card stating 1-800-GATEWAY, and I was instructed to call this number and get some help, because they said what you have is a drug problem. And I just was very confused, because I didn't feel that that's what was my only problem. But but so that's the beginning of my experience, and honestly, the rest is a blessing. It was a blessing. I was introduced to a drug court. I was amazed by the support I got while I participated in the drug court. I was amazed by the support that I was receiving from my social worker, from my attorney. There wasn't a time where I was waiting too long to get a call back. If I was in a panic, if something was going wrong, or I hit a bump on the road, I was able to get my needs met. I was able to successfully reunify. I had an amazing mentor parent who helped me gain some type of self-worth, gain some confidence, gain some hope, create goals for myself. I didn't know about goals. My upbringing was a little chaotic, and there was a lot of things that I did not experience growing up. You know, during the drug court reviews, I was praised for my accomplishments, and there was a lot of the times where that praise would bring me to tears, just because I didn't know how great that felt. And that was my experience, and I'm grateful for it. And unfortunately, not everybody has that experience, and mine really was a blessing, and I was willing. That was kind of one of my key components, was that I was willing to make the changes that I needed to make in order to reunify with my child as soon as possible.
And could you describe, I mean, you said your experience was better than some other parents that you've worked with. I mean, you've now been working as a mentor for several years. Can you describe your role as a mentor, what you do, what your role is in the system of helping parents, and if you have any, I mean, it sounds like you had a very fortunate experience, but you've seen a lot of different things. If there are things about the system that you would change, if you could, it would be great to hear about those too.
Gosh, that's a heavy things I would change. Well, you know, visitation has been a big issue recently, and that's because of lack of foster homes. And there's a few parents who have had to arrange for transportation on their own to go visit their kids out of town. And some parents would be allowed 2 times a week, and they would be able to, you know, get maybe assistance for one, but maybe not. And I just think that that I can compare it to a particular situation that I went through when my son was in Redwood City, and I was in San Jose, and I was asked that I needed to find my own transportation, and I freaked out, and I made, you know, some calls to some support, and I talked to, you know, my counselor at residential, and I ended up getting a ride from a social worker to Redwood City and back, and I just feel like it can be done, and it is possible, and I don't know why it's not possible now, but I think that visitation is crucial for parents. I mean, for them to have something to motivate them, and I think that, you know, maybe, you know, I think that the biggest complication is when we get a parent that I am introduced that is homeless. They're homeless. There's no way of anybody contacting them. They have no phone. They're homeless. I mean, I can't really add to that. And there's no way of. They have to literally. I mean, and if there's homeless, I would assume that there's some mental health. I mean, they probably don't feel, proud of their situation. Maybe they do. I don't know. But I think that, I just think that, poverty is a big issue, and I don't know if the changes that I would make are realistic, because I believe some parents do need to make some changes, and that's just the reality of things. Some parents do need to make some changes in their life, and I just think that if we help the family, I think that the bus pass thing is sometimes an issue, and like transportation and case plan, and when they see this big old list of classes and stuff that they need to do, my first thought is how do I get them all done, because this is what I need to do. I don't think that it would be helpful if I just made sure I got this one class done, and then move on to the next. Sometimes sometimes parents have 2 to 3 appointments a day, and sometimes they have to test, they visit, they have to go to a meeting. There's just a lot of things, or parenting classes.
This is the example of what I was talking about. I mean, if you have 2 to 3 appointments a day, so let's say you don't have a car, you are going to very different parts of the city. There's no way you can hold a job. There's no way you can even look for a job. I've seen parents who brought this up in court, and they were told, where are your priorities? But of course, if you also are expected to have housing, and it's a problem. So all of these, I mean, sometimes the fixes are very concrete material fixes, like bus passes or transportation. I wonder if we can I want to ask Sabrina, to bring Sabrina into the conversation. I mean, when we were talking beforehand, one of the problems she brought up, in addition to all the problems we've laden you with so far, is that how you experience the system has to do with, in great part, where you are. There can be vastly divergent responses depending on which county your case comes up in, and needless to say, state by state, it's more different still. And so I was wondering if you could give us some examples of the divergent standards in different places that you've seen, and if there's anything you think should be or could be done about that.
Yes, I think much could be done, and not nearly enough has been done. So I've been practicing in child welfare now for over a decade. I began my career in New York, and now have been in California for 5 years. So I've practiced in 2 different states, which have incredibly different standards for the legal standard that would have to be met by the Department of Social Services to legally remove a child from a parent and detain them into foster care. So when I was in New York, I fortunately started to practice shortly after a case, Nicolson versus Scopetta, had been passed, or had been decided on by the highest court in New York, which clarified that in order to actually remove a child from a parent, CPS, or ACS, had to show that that child was in imminent risk of harm, imminent risk of physical harm, or such severe neglect that they would be imminently harmed, and that it could not be alleviated by any sort of services. So I was able to go into court as a young attorney and actually use a law that was helpful because it gave a clearer standard about what the actual test was. This replaced what was commonly referred to as the safer course doctrine. Safer course. Can you imagine the number of minds that could disagree about a safer course? So this was really helpful as a young attorney for me, and when I was able to start practicing this law in Brooklyn Family Court, I fortunately was part of a team of attorneys where we were able to consistently hold the court to that standard, and we saw tremendous change in what had happened before. I'd like to note that Mercedes' case actually started right at the beginning of when the Bronx defenders started to have a family defense unit. So what happened in Mercedes' case was very emblematic of what I had then learned had been happening for decades in New York City, where parents would go into court for some flaw, right? Something that might have raised eyebrows, but not necessarily, again, have been a sensationalistic, newsworthy item. And then it would become this momentous task for parents to be able to then prove that they were such good parents that they could get their children back. So what we've now seen is now these offices have been in existence for a decade in New York City, and prominent foundations like Casey Family Programs are now funding robust studies to actually document how there has been a drastic decrease in the number of children even entering foster care in the first place now because that legal standard is being enforced. And also a quicker return of those children home because the legal standards are actually being enforced. And because what Professor Wald expressed as the initial intent of these federal laws and state laws is actually being executed with more fidelity. In California, we have a pretty good standard. Children must be there must be substantial danger to the children's physical health or very severe emotional damage that the child is suffering in order to justify continuing to keep a child away from their parent. And again, there needs to be some analysis of can we remedy this? Is there some service that could be put in place before we take that drastic action? In states like Mississippi, there was an article in The Nation magazine last week that highlighted how parents in Mississippi actually have no right to an attorney when their children are taken into foster care. This is one of 9 states in the United States where parents do not have a right to counsel at all if you can't afford an attorney. In Mississippi, the neglect standard is so discretionary that I present it to my law students and they come back to me saying this isn't really a standard. This is just, do you think there's neglect? Well, let's take them into care. It's again the safer course doctrine. So what we see is that as a parent, if you move to a different state, you could have a tremendously different outcome, even if you're in the same situation, depending on the laws that are in place, but also depending on your access to counsel and whether or not there are attorneys to actually defend you in that situation. So the travesty of this is that there are far too many children in our country who are in foster care in the first place, and that we are criminalizing poverty also, not just in the criminal justice system, but in the foster care system. And we are not really addressing what children actually need. Children actually need to be raised in loving homes. My co-founder Eliza is great at pointing this out, that although love may not be enough to raise a child in a significantly successful way, without love, it is impossible for children to do well. And this system routinely invests in the notion of separating a child from a loving family with flaws, with the idea that if we invest in foster care, then somebody else will do a better job. From representing children now that I've moved to California, I can tell you that the system does not do a better job. Children raised in institutions do not do well. It is exceptional when they do. And we are so grateful for those situations where, in fact, they're taken into a loving foster home and where, in fact, those become adoptive homes. But I'm telling you, those are the aberration and not the norm. There's a Doyle study that we often cite in my work, which talks about how children raised in marginal homes actually do better if they're left in those marginal homes, even without assistance, than they do if you take children out of their home and raise them in a system. What if we actually listened to that and bolstered the home situation so that a child could be raised with love and also with stable housing. And that the money that we spend, the millions of dollars that we spend on foster care, were actually diverted to housing subsidies for low-income people and other financial supports, childcare subsidies and other significant things, so that poor families could actually get what they need, and that we stop blaming poor parents for impossible situations that they cannot fix on their own. So that's what this work is about for me. It becomes really a systemic issue incredibly fast, but we got to start somewhere. So we're starting with trying to create model legal offices where at least we can try to hold to a legal standard or try to reform a legal standard and try to bring some individual parents the supports they need. But we really as a society need to think much longer and harder about where we invest our dollars.
I wonder if, before we go to audience questions, Professor Walsh, you ended with how difficult it is to enforce statutes, no matter how well they may be drafted. And I've seen that even though Nicolson v. Scopetta that you mentioned is a very good standard in New York, it has limited effect. How can that be improved upon? How can you draft standards that do a better job of preventing unnecessary removals while not boxing in judges so tightly that they can't use their discretion at all and take into account individual circumstances?
I'll try and answer that, but I want to cover a couple of things in that regard. And I might say as a starting point, I'm working with Sabrina and with Eliza on their new program representing parents, which I think is an incredibly important program. And parent mentors, people who have been through the system since, as Victoria described, often when protective services comes in, the parent's not happy to see them. And the initial reaction will be hostile to somebody coming into the home. And parent attitude plays a very big role in the worker's judgment, whether to remove or to become involved. And many of the people who are in this system have had a lot of rejections in life, a lot of disappointments of investing any trust in anybody, and they're not likely to have trust of somebody coming in and saying, I'm a social worker, I'm going to investigate you, but I'm also going to help you. It's an impossible role of conveying, and having somebody who's been through the system, who can relate to parents and talk with them about it is very important. I want to take a somewhat different perspective from what Sabrina just said, although I think, I'm not sure we would disagree. A very large percentage of the families that get referred to Child Protective Services are facing multiple difficulties. They're facing difficulties because many have drug problems, some have mental health problems. The great bulk are suffering from poverty and poor housing. They often are separated and hostile from their own family support systems. That varies, but that was partly the case there. And if you look at the families, and they're in areas with very poor services, poor schools, concentrated poverty. If you look at the system from the perspective of children, if nothing had happened to help Mercedes, which didn't help her very much, but if nothing had happened, or if nothing had happened to help Victoria, their children could not look forward to reasonable lives on the outcomes that I was talking about. They may not have been able to look forward to safety, and certainly on the mental health and emotional and other sets of development. The problem is that Foster care is a very difficult alternative because we don't have good foster homes. One of the big changes over time is we've been using grandparents and other kinship more, which makes it a lot better and able to work better. But leaving the children at home in the situations that they're finding themselves is also not a reasonable outcome. So therefore, you want to find a way to build a system that does this somewhat better for them. If you had the very best judges in the country and well-trained and committed in time, you would give them lots of discretion and broad laws and say, do your job because you have good judgment, if you also knew that they had a lot of resources to be able to back up what they were trying to do there in terms of services, and they were trying to involve parents in an adequate way, you would give a lot of discretion. Unfortunately, more places look like Mississippi than look like Santa Clara in terms of the set of resources that are available, and judges vary. In Santa Clara, Judge Edwards was on the juvenile court bench for 20 years, or at least, right? More, right. In many places, they're on for 12 months and they rotate off and they change and they don't have training, and the same thing, there's big turnover of social workers. They don't have resources, but the fact of the matter is that our country is not prepared to give poor people, and particularly poor people who don't seem to be providing adequate care for their children, $50,000 or $60,000 to care for them. We don't, in Mississippi, we give them $200 a month if they're not in the child welfare system under welfare stuff. There's just no resources that are going to come to this system.
Can I just interject here that the reason he mentions that particular figure is that that is the amount of money that the foster parents in Mercedes' case were receiving.
They got $60,000 of money because the children had special needs, but there's no way just to take the problems from a perspective of designing something. You cannot make access to adequate housing dependent upon coming into the child welfare system. If your key to getting a Section 8 voucher or better housing is to neglect your children, you're going to neglect your children to get the housing. You can't make it contingent in the same way that you can't make getting the limited slots that we have in job training programs only available to people in the criminal justice system, because then the incentive will be to commit a crime to get into a better slot. I've reached the conclusion that we're talking about a lot of children who are in a lot of jeopardy in a range of ways because our society doesn't meet their, because our society doesn't help their parents or give them good schools or a range of other things. We will never solve that through the child protective system because we will not transfer the kind of resources to the child protective system for what are conceived of as problem parents, that when there are other parents out there who are poor. We just won't do that politically. There's no constituency, there's no way to sell it. That the only way to make this system work is to limit the child protective system to kids in significant danger, and then we have to have universal programs, starting with health and nutrition programs, support in home visiting, not home visitors monitoring people, but home visitors coming and helping people. I was saying, to somebody earlier, when my wife and I had our first child, we were both in law school. Our parents' gift to us was Mrs. Fotakis, who was our home visitor. I mean, they paid for Mrs. Fotakis to come live with us for 2 weeks, which if we didn't have would have been, we would have been in the child welfare system. We need a set of universal services. Other countries have universal home visiting. We need universal early Head Start and a range of other kinds of community-based clinics until we move to that kind of system and then devote extra money to the really needed high-level substance abuse and mental health services that people with deeper end problems need. We will never build a system out of the Child Protective Services system, but we should not think that those children don't need help. The question is whether our country is really going to build a support system for all children, or we're just going to have this residual system that can't work.
So can I just say,
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
I actually really agree with Michael on this. And, what I think your point really makes crystal clear is that child welfare is a policing part of our government. It is part of our police state. And we have been operating as if it's part, maybe, there's nobody really wants to admit that. Nobody really wants to admit that. When you go into being, child welfare workers want to feel like they're improving the world. They want to feel like, hey, I get to support this family. I get to do this thing. But then they quickly, I think, realize, oh, I am policing these people. And we continue to think that that is the way to give people social supports. Victoria did not do well because she was policed. That first interview where she was getting asked unfair questions in her most vulnerable time, that sounds like the least helpful part, right? What was helpful were when she met her lawyer and the peer parent mentor and the social worker within that office who actually had her back, who actually believed in her. None of the parents I know do well because there are people constantly criticizing them. The parents I know who do really well have a robust support system of people who believe in them and believe in their potential even when things are getting really hard. And so I wholeheartedly endorse Michael's approach, which is let's actually invest in all of the preventive services that are delivered in a way that is consensual, where parents can actually feel like it's meaningful help, because people do want to improve. Parents, in my experience, now practicing in this field for over a decade, parents love their children and want to do better by them and just need to be given actual meaningful avenues of support. Maybe there are going to be some exceptions where there needs to be coercion, but again, if we could narrow the focus of the child welfare system to actually those cases where there is severe harm, we could do a better job on those cases too, because right now we are diluting the system by throwing in all of this neglect that maybe is not the higher level neglect and is distracting all of us and making our work much less precise.
Mm-hmm. And just to add one other moving part, I think the press also plays a role in this, because no matter what standards are created by people like Professor Wald or fought for by people like Sabrina, if the press is creating an incentive for judges and caseworkers to be terrified that they will be splashed on the front page of the tabloids if they get something wrong, it doesn't matter what the statute says. It's going to always seem like the cautious thing to do to remove children. And that's a very, very significant incentive that needs to be altered. I don't know how one does that, but somehow enough knowledge and outrage has to be generated that it will be seen as a topic worth writing about in tabloid newspapers when a child is removed for no good reason and a family is destroyed. Unfortunately, we're going in the opposite direction. There have been now, very recently, a couple of cases where child protective caseworkers have been legally prosecuted for failing to remove children who were subsequently harmed. So it was already a significant incentive for the caseworkers to remove, to have the threat of being publicly pilloried and to have on their conscience a harmed child. But now, in addition, you have prosecution. All the incentives are pushing in the direction of removal and almost none in the other. And I think unless you have a kind of development of public outrage and knowledge about this that's going to continue to be so, no matter what the letter of the law. So we should go to questions from the audience, and there's only one microphone. I was about to say, I was looking for the other one, and I could not see it. Here is the microphone. If anyone wants to ask a question, please come up so we can hear you.
I'll start and hope other people come from behind. I was a public school teacher for a couple of years, and I'm wondering, for anyone on the panel, in light of the manifold problems you identify, I believe it's the case that for almost any public school teacher, there's an affirmative obligation to report to someone, not sure always who, but to report to someone the suspicion that there might be abuse in the home. I think this applies to healthcare workers as well. So if you see a bruise on a child, if I were thinking how to explain the 7 million cases, I would think that this plays a large role in it. So my question is it a good policy to have an affirmative obligation for reporting the mere suspicion of abuse on the basis of visible or other types of observation of children by healthcare workers or teachers? And then a second question, completely unrelated, I'm interested about the politics of changing the situation. So when I think about the conservative forces in the United States at the moment, on the one hand, I think they champion policies that might be friendly to the types of changes you have in mind, in part because they're so enthusiastic about a parental right to the upbringing of their own children. On the other hand, as the saying sometimes goes, since you're trying to think about a range of policy approaches, not just within the CPS system, some conservatives might think that the care for a child is from conception until birth and then no longer. So the parental right for the child, on the one hand, good. The concern for a child only until birth, maybe not so good. Two questions.
So I'll say something on mandatory reporting laws. Every state has these laws that mandate a bunch of professionals to report, and they define abuse and neglect more broadly than actually the courts do, because the goal is to get not to miss something and then let others screen it out. That leads, as I say, to 7 million children being reported, ultimately 200,000 being removed, only 700,000 cases being substantiated. So we have over 6 million reports that nothing happens with a lot of resources. I think that's a very big problem, that mandatory reports are not a very good way to get and one of the things you can tell, here's a professor at Stanford, one of the most knowledgeable people in his field. He was a public school teacher who had a duty to report, but he didn't really know what it was. We draft all these laws, but if you think that people on the ground know what they are, you've got to change your mind about your role as a lawyer or a legislator. So I think if we had a set of protective, of these alternative services that I've talked about, I would create referrals to those services and limit reporting laws, either not at all, as in some other countries, or to very extreme cases, so that we're not getting into the court system those cases, but and wasting the resources on the 6 million cases that we do nothing about now anyway.
You want to add to that?
Not for that part.
Okay. You want to address the second part?
I could start, but I'd like you to weigh in too. I'm curious about whether or not this issue might be one of those parts where we can get the left and the right to sort of see eye to eye. I mean, having a family is such a visceral right, and in this time, I think it's even more essential that we be identifying some of those issues that genuinely could be across the aisle agreement about. Right.
I mean, it was Reagan who said the 6, how many words, scary words, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. That's kind of the intuition of conservatives on a range of topics, but certainly of liberals on this topic. This is one area where we can all be wary of state power together. So maybe there's some hope in that. And certainly, as you say, I mean, the feeling of the integrity of the family is such a fundamental thing that it crosses quite a few lines, though cannot be relied upon to produce similar intuitions, as we know. But in this area, I do think there's hope. Though, I mean, as Sabrina pointed out, and as Michael has also pointed out, even though there are a lot of resources available in this system, and that was one of the surprising things that I encountered sitting in family court. Foster parents being paid $60,000 to take care of kids. Like, that's a lot of money that's being used in this system, but whether it can ever be diverted to, I mean, Mercedes would despair. How come this foster mother is getting paid $60,000 to take care of my children, and in addition to that, being given housing and also extra help, extra child care help? I mean, a huge amount of services were being given to this foster parent. Not that I don't want to deny foster parents services, but Mercedes would sort of beat her head against the wall and say, if I only had a fraction of that, even if I were guaranteed a sort of safe housing, forget the $60,000, I would be able to take care of my children who I so desperately want back. So, well, I agree with Michael that it's hard to imagine a political route from here to there. It's frustrating because the money is in the system already.
I asked for here.
Yes.
Did you get any pushback on your article in writing it? I mean, in my field, it was a very refreshing article.
What's your field?
I'm a parents attorney.
Oh, okay.
And so it was very refreshing to read your article. I felt it was well balanced from the perspective of this parent who really struggled. Did you get any pushback from your editors or from anybody else in the media about writing it in the way you did?
I didn't get pushback from the media. That's an interesting question, though what I didn't manage to answer, I had a question that I abandoned, though I do think it's important because, as I said, the incentives given by press coverage are very, very significant in this system. I wanted to know, there are lots of cases, sadly, where children are killed by their parents, and some of them become these massive media events that are transformative and have huge impact on child removals. The most recent big case, at least in New York, I don't know if it was as big a deal out here, was a little boy named Zymir Perkins who was killed in September 2016. And as an immediate consequence, the number of removals to foster care went up by 30%. So there's huge impact. Now, there were lots of other children killed, and it was not obvious to me. There was no socioeconomic category of child that was made a fuss about. I mean, it was not clear to me why some became these era-defining cases and others did not. And I started calling around in the media to try to find out the answer to that, and I didn't manage to. But I do think that is, of course, I'm a journalist, I would think so, but I do think that somehow changing the media's sense of what constitutes a story in the child protection area is a very significant and important factor in all of this.
I have a question, obviously. Unless I'm wrong, and please correct me if I am, I understand that it's possible to have your children removed without actually reaching the point of being criminally negligent or abusive. So there are two groups, parents who have their kids who are removed for a certain range of reasons and those who are actually criminally liable. What % of parents who have their children removed are prosecuted for criminal neglect or abuse or what have you? It seems like those two groups would warrant very different treatments.
Well, there is a significant amount of overlap. It's not necessarily tracked in any reliable way, so I don't have a statistic I can give you. It's a number that we're still trying to figure out for Alameda County, where we're trying to do our work. And I know that the folks from Dependency Advocacy Center have been trying to figure out that number too, and have been able to come to ballpark figures. But both systems interface with the same community, essentially, the same communities. And so I agree. I would think what we're speaking about is wishing that indeed those more egregious cases were the ones that the system actually spent time on.
But this is the puzzling thing. You would think that the standard for removing someone's children, once someone got to that point, they should also be criminally liable. I mean, surely the standard should be very high, but oddly it isn't. And at one point I asked Mercedes's lawyers, it seemed really weird to me that she was not being given her three older children back for years and years and years, and yet here she was with a young baby. No one was taking the baby away. No one questioned her ability to mother this baby. And I said, that seems really odd to me. Either she's a capable parent or not. And is that really unusual? And they said, weirdly, it is not unusual. So there's, as I said, there's some kind of momentum in the system that takes over once you have a case. It can be a fairly high bar to get your children taken away. Something significant has to happen. But in order to get them back, it can take forever. And so although you would think that there would be a very tight correlation between criminal liability and child removal, it's actually less the case than you would imagine.
It's been a little while since I've been involved in the business, but about 20-odd years ago, the law used to require that before a child could be removed, there had to be something called reasonable efforts to keep the child in the home. And I personally have never understood exactly what that meant. And but as I thought about it, as I tried to advocate for parents, it seemed to me that it ought to be something comparable to what you're going to spend on these children in foster care. And I couldn't think in a capitalist society any other particular way to measure what could be reasonable efforts. And I'm wondering what, if anything, is the state of reasonable efforts these days, if any.
Well, the expert on reasonable effort standards is actually Judge Len Edwards, who's right there. So I would encourage you to talk to Judge Edwards afterward, and he has quite a number of publications and trainings on this issue. Oh, there we go.
So I'll give you just a small story on that. It is required in the law that there be reasonable efforts. It was in this law that I drafted. And actually, the original version of the law very much specified what reasonable efforts look like. It specified the kinds of things, many of the things that Len Edwards has developed. In the course of the legislation passing through, Senator Russell Long said to me, Michael, we don't tell states what to do, just tell them to make reasonable efforts. And that's where the term came from, with no further guidance. And the law was passed, and it was supposed to be then implemented by regulations by the Department of Health and Human Services, but the law was passed right at the end of the Carter administration. The Reagan administration came in and wanted to have nothing to do with the law, and so they didn't draft any regulations. So all of this business is always just circumstances that highly vary by jurisdictions.
Hi, thank you all so much for being here. I think this is a really fantastic kind of array of different levels of the system, so thank you so much for adding your perspectives. I was just wondering if you've done a really great job of outlining the problems of the system and the heaviness and the pervasiveness of it, and I was just wondering if you could maybe each say a little bit about where you see hope, either on a practical level in your day-to-day work or on a broader systems level, like hope for our system. So if you could just speak a little to that, I'd really appreciate it.
Do you want to say something, Victoria? I mean, you've had You're the only parent I've ever encountered who said that they had a, on balance, positive experience. So perhaps you can explain, like, what, I mean, you gave the outline of people were helpful. Why did you, could you say a little more about why you had a good experience when so many of the parents you've worked with as a mentor have not?
I think that the experience came from the participation of, the positive experience came from participating in the drug court. That was aside from the legal hearings that I had to attend for the reviews. And working with a mentor parent was also very positive, and the social worker, I felt comfortable enough to come to her or call her about almost anything. And I really can't explain why that was. I just feel that she was a great social worker. She showed up when I needed her to, and she sent the referrals when I needed her to, for the classes I needed to attend on my case plan. Everything was like in line accordingly. Like I didn't have to wait on things. I also had a lot of help, a lot of squeaky wheels. I was a little whiny myself, and I didn't give up if I felt something was off. And I think that my hope in the future is that everybody that touches the system is able to have a mentor parent, somebody that can point things out in a different environment, perhaps, not at court, not in an office, out in the community, or just somewhere where the parent might be more willing to take suggestion, or more willing to understand what's going on. And I think what I'm seeing recently is a lot of the community is beginning to see the problem, and the community is being invited. The community is being asked, what is it that you need? How can we help you? And I hope that in the future that minimizes the families that come into the system, because we want to get them the help that they need prior, simple stuff or difficult things, just the community being able to voice what they need.
I have a good example of hope. I have been also representing children recently, and one of the child clients that I sort of inherited had first been removed from her mother on her first birthday. And there was sort of, she had, essentially her mother's rights were terminated to her by the time that she was turning about 7. And she then, her list of foster homes actually takes up a page and a half that her social worker wrote for her. So I reviewed that when I first got her case. And I had a hard time contacting this young woman in her foster home, and was trying to figure out why were they obstructionist. I later learned that she had been sexually abused in that foster home when she ran away. And the person who called me was her, when I was trying to figure out where is this young woman. She was 15, she'd run away, we didn't quite know where she was. Her biological mother called me. And one of the last home visits I just did was to see this now 16-year-old fully back with her mom. And because of California law, I was able to file a petition in court to reinstate this mother's parental rights. The girl had sort of kept tabs on her mom, had learned that her mother was actually doing a lot better than when she'd first been removed from her mom. Her mother had been trying during her daughter's entire life to really separate herself from an abusive relationship, to deal with her own childhood trauma, and to really get on her feet. And she did so incredibly well this past year that the court, with the support of the Department of Social Services, actually supported my client being able to have her parental rights reinstated for her mother and then actually be able to reunite with her and get help from the department to find housing. So to me, the reason that I do this work is because I do see people do what seems like the most impossible, unthinkable thing. And I do find people to actually make the transformation that they deeply want to make. And that's why I do this, and I think it's amazing work to do. And obviously that doesn't happen all the time, and there's a lot of tragedy in it. But I hold on to those cases because they give me the hope that this is all worth it.
So let me just, Larissa, Victoria is not an N of one.
No.
There actually are a lot of parents who will tell you that they got helped and they got helped. There is just enormous variation in the quality of what's available. But things like family group conferencing, we're bringing whole families in, more kinship care, specialized courts, really good drug treatment, a range of things that are available in some places and not in other places. When they're available with a good judge, they can really make a difference for parents who are struggling. A lot of these parents are struggling. I want to be really clear. My concern is not that everything is bad. I just don't believe we can take the good to scale within the child protective thing countrywide, and that's why I want to build alternative systems that I think can be taken to scale. But there are a lot of things that could be done within the existing system, of which there are models that actually parents like.
Absolutely, and I think another thing that's been very helpful is interdisciplinary practices like the one that Sabrina is creating, where social workers, parent mentors, and attorneys all work together. And it is really difficult to be a parent defender, but the Bronx Defenders has, one of the reasons that they are so effective is not just that they have the support of these different types of workers, but that they really like each other. And they support each other as they go out and sing karaoke on a regular basis. And I think that is actually crucial because when things are really, really difficult, they talk to each other, they're really genuinely friends, whereas as Victoria has pointed out, it's essential to have social workers and caseworkers that are actually caring and able to really give help, but many of them can't, not because they're bad people, but because they've just started and they will probably quit in a year. And when I asked, there was one social worker in Mercedes' 9-year saga in this system, there was one social worker who really, really helped her, really cared, believed in her, thought that she could get her kids back, thought she ought to get her kids back. It made an enormous difference. And I asked this woman had previously worked in the Child Protective Services, and I asked her, what was the hardest thing about that? And you can imagine just how many awfully hard things there are in that job. And she said, actually, the hardest thing was I did not have any support from my colleagues, because the way that the work was structured was that we were either out in the field all day or we were consumed by paperwork. We never got to know each other. There was no structure for supporting each other in the way that the Bronx Defender attorneys have. And that's something that is eminently possible. That is not a pie in the sky thing. It just needs to be identified as something that makes a huge difference in a caseworker continuing to work and becoming a really good caring person of the kind that can help a parent or not, or quitting. Yes. Yeah, why don't we, that's a good idea. It's almost 7 o'clock.
Hi, is it working?
Yeah.
I have 2 questions. My first question is to Victoria Ruiz. I was wondering, what did you mean by your squeaky wheel? And also I want to say that I'm glad that the social service has worked out for you, but.
Squeaky wheel. And can we just bring in both questions? The lady behind you also, sir?
I'll answer after she answers her question.
Okay.
So just so we have to wrap up really quickly.
Yeah, I'm a medical student here at Stanford, and I'm lucky enough to be on a scholarship, and I see kids in the clinics every day here who are not in safe home situations. And I had considered that maybe it was my duty or the right thing to do to think about becoming a foster mom in my future to pay forward some of that great good fortune from my own life. But this makes me reconceptualize that in a really different way. Do you think that that's just sort of recapitulating a structural violence against families who would be better off being invested in another way? And if so, what is that investment and what does it look like?
Do you want to answer first?
Okay,
The
yes.
squeaky wheel question.
Yes, the squeaky wheel. You know, sometimes, so the example with that goes that, so if somebody doesn't answer your call, you keep calling, you leave messages. If you get nowhere at that point, then you begin documenting it. When you called, day, time. If that doesn't work, then you begin emails. Once you create the paper trail, in my experience, that gives your attorney the opportunity to have that to argue that you've done everything you can to reach out, to seek help, or to, nope, just that. And that the social worker, unfortunately, or therapist, I'm sorry, it's just social worker. Social worker didn't get back to, mother or father, and they went far and beyond to try to, get this situation taken care of. That's what I mean.
Does someone want to answer the foster care question very quickly? I know it's a very deep question.
I could answer it quickly. So I think being a foster parent is an incredibly admirable duty to take on. It's essentially needed, and I think we need more people who are in foster parenting for well-informed reasons and for good-hearted reasons. I think that one of the challenges is that there's not necessarily enough public education for everybody about what the parents are going through, and there may be sort of a bias or prejudice against parents that they may be overly blamed, and that the foster parents might not sort of understand the full context. Foster parents are also not given a lot of information about the family. They're not supposed to, and that also puts them at a deficit of being able to properly empathize. Foster parenting also is, it's one of these areas of law that sort of, it's like domestic work in a way that's really underpaid actually, right? Even though it's a lot of money compared to what could be given to poor parents to keep their children, it's actually a very low, it's not a wage, right? And there's a way where we're really expecting a lot of foster parents, that they are sort of pseudo-professionals in a way, like mental health professionals to deal with kids' behavior. They're going to have to deal with that kid's trauma from being removed in addition to whatever other issues that child had that brought them into the system, right? We do need to do more to actually support foster parents, and I think it gets to this thing of, can we actually isolate the number of cases we need to bring into the system and actually fully prepare the players within the system, including foster parents who are in some ways really professionals, and their goal is to reunify that family, which might not necessarily be the reason people go into foster parenting, but it is really the job, So it's complicated, right?
On that note, it is certainly complicated. Thank you for coming.
Very good answer.